5 Live.
Unfortunately, due to rights restrictions, we're not able to bring you the current sports commentary on this platform. You may be able to...
And you might have been dealing with, you know, dreadful conditions somewhere, and you're straight into one of the richest parts of the world. So that's...
If you just reduce the world outside the theatre to Sloane Square, and you try and make people feel bad that they walk out and they see Peter Jones and a rank of black cabs and maybe someone begging outside the station. You know, you're kind of blaming them for the fact that that inequality exists exactly outside the theatre. So you've got to go wider than that. It's not about making people feel bad that the theatre's in Sloane Square.
Now, one play was you had an incident where the audience were required to hand in their mobile phones, and then you stamped on one. Right? You're looking at me blankly as I'm making this up.
This is a show I did with Hannah Walker, the poet. They were required to leave their phones on. We all sat in the room and everyone's phone was on, and actually it was about our sense of connection with our devices, and if people's phones rang, they were encouraged to take the call. We did that show kind of several hundred times, and we had some amazing phone calls. And there was a bit where we asked them to put them in the middle, and then I stamped on and destroyed one of their phones. I got very good at sliding a dummy phone into that group of phones and stamping on that, and that worked all the time apart from
one night.
One night.
So somebody saw their own phone being stamped on and destroyed by you.
Yeah, we also did it. My favourite one was doing it in front of a bunch of teenagers who have an incredible relationship with their phones, and there was that moment of kind of action movie leaping as I kind of descended on the phone when they all came into the centre to try and save their most precious objects.
Yeah. So I could get the sense of you like sort of playing with the form, playing with the structure of theatre, not just a narrative of beginning, middle, end, as Arthur was saying. You like to explore those different ways of surprising the audience or taking the audience into even an uncomfortable place.
Yeah, because absolutely, what's the point of having that little bit of reality that everyone's agreed to share if you're not prepared to kind of screw about with it a bit?
Okay, well, you could see reality screwed about a bit in Victory Condition. Some people understand the term Victory Condition. It's a gaming term, which is slightly beyond me. But anyway, Victory Condition is at London's Royal Court Theatre until Saturday the 21st of October. Thank you very much, Chris Thorpe, for joining us. That's the loose ends tied up for this week. You can hear us again, as well as recent loose ends guests such as Tim Mitchell and P.P. Arnold. This is available by the BBC Radio 4 website and all good podcast suppliers. But in any format and in any event, my thanks to all my guests, Chris Thorpe, Linda Lewis and Jessica Rain, Bedouin and Siv Jacobson, Arthur Smith and Kevin Bishop. Next week, my guests will include Jensen Button and Frank Skinner. Until then, from me for now, goodbye.
Loose Ends was presented by Clive Anderson and produced by the Loose Ends team. And as Clive said, if you'd like to listen again to any of the recent music performances on the show, just head to the Loose Ends pages of the BBC Radio 4 website. The news is next, and then Edward Sturton will be profiling the former minister and the mistress of the deadpan one-liner, Baroness Trumpington, who this week announced that she'll retire from the House of Lords, aged 95. That's in Profile in a couple of minutes. But first, let's take a look ahead to the coming week when Radio 4 will be dispensing some very useful advice.
So here is my step-by-step guide to making my favourite cake.
Sarah Millican reads from her memoir on BBC Radio 4.
When I started, I was nervous, but then I thought, I can build a flat-pack table. I'm sure I can make a cake.
Part autobiography, part self-help book.
Step 1, put the oven on. It's the cupboard that gets hot.
One of Britain's best-loved comedians.
Step 20, when it's done, take it out of the oven and take a photo of it. If anyone is in the house, shout them down to look at it. Ask them several times if they think it looks amazing.
How to Be Champion, this Monday to Friday morning at 11:15, and then available on the BBC Radio 4 website.
BBC News at 7 o'clock. A Canadian man kidnapped with his pregnant wife by Islamist militants in Afghanistan 5 years ago has given a graphic account of their ordeal. Joshua Boyle said his American wife had been raped and the kidnappers had murdered one of the couple's 4 children, all of whom were born in captivity. The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, welcomed the family's return.
I'm going to ask people to respect their privacy and understand they've been through an extremely difficult period right now. But I can certainly say that we're pleased that the ordeal they've been through over these past years has finally come to an end.
The organisation responsible for the Oscars is meeting to discuss whether Harvey Weinstein's membership should be revoked. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences has previously called the allegations abhorrent. The film producer denies the sexual assault claims. The US-backed coalition besieging Raqqa in northern Syria has said that foreign fighters belonging to the Islamic State group must either surrender or die. The last group of Syrian IS fighters has been taken out of their former stronghold on buses, leaving only foreign jihadists. But in a statement, the coalition said it did not condone any arrangement that allowed terrorists to escape without facing justice. British intelligence officials believe Iran was behind a cyber attack on Parliament in June. Thousands of email accounts, including those of senior ministers, were targeted. Weather forecasters have warned that parts of the Irish Republic could be hit by winds of more than 80 miles an hour when the remains of Hurricane Ophelia strikes the country on Monday. It's very unusual for a strong hurricane to travel so far east in the Atlantic. In the Premier League, Chelsea were beaten by Crystal Palace, and Manchester City beat Stoke 7-2 to go 2 points clear at the top of the table. In Scotland, there were 1-0 wins for both Celtic and Aberdeen, who are separated by goal differences at the top of the table. BBC News.
Sally Potter's new film, The Party, comes on next Saturday at New Spot. But first here on Radio 4, it's Profile.
It should surely come as a shock when a nonagenarian decides to retire. But Lady Trumpington's decision to leave the House of Lords when she reaches 95 this month made a splash. Perhaps that's because she's been part of the place for so long, no one can quite imagine the scene without her.
It would be ungallant of me to tell you her ladyship's age, so let's just say she was born before this programme started, and before BBC One started, and before television started. Please welcome Baroness Trumpington!
She began among pearls and ermine, and she's ending her long career in similar territory. On the way, she's lived our history and known most of the people who made it. But she only really became famous in her late 80s, when she was caught by the cameras making a V sign at one of her fellow peers, as the comedian Jack Whitehall reminded her on Have I Got News for You.
Do you regret swearing at him?
No, because I regretted what he said, which was the people my age were starting to look very, very, very old. Well, wouldn't you do that if you were...
Jean Campbell Harris was born in 1922, the child of one of those Anglo-American alliances which were such a feature of the smart set in the 20s. Her father was a former major in the Bengal Lancers with the right connections. Her mother was the heir to a Chicago paint fortune. Georgina Morley published Jean's autobiography.
She was really quite grand. You know, she was born into enormous wealth. Her mother was an American heiress, and they lived in a mansion round the corner from where John Lewis now is on Oxford Street, until 1929, when Jean was 7, and the money rather ran away.
And really ran away, did it? I mean, did they go through a period of real hardship?
Let's not go nuts. As Jean herself says, it was a bit like the chap who said they had to move to a smaller house, but they could still have a butler.
The crash and its consequences provided her with a life lesson in resilience. She remembered years later on Desert Island Discs.
When the crash came, my mother was left with nothing, and she had wonderful taste, and she became an interior decorator, and luckily she had rich friends, and she kept the household going.
Her formal education was limited, as was often the way for women then, and she says she's never taken an exam, but finishing school in Paris gave her good French and German. The war began when she was 16.
Down on the farm, the land girls are doing their bit and a bit more.
Like thousands of other young women, Jean Campbell Harris was sent to work as a land girl, filling the gap left when the countryside's young men went to fight. But the social niceties survived even in total war. The farm she was sent to belonged to a family friend, one David Lloyd George, the former Prime Minister. In 1940, she took her language skills to the secret code-breaking centre of Bletchley Park. She was a cipher clerk and worked on German naval codes. Her son remembers that, like many of those who worked there, she was reluctant to talk about what was involved, but she's been very open about other aspects of her time at Bletchley.
And when we weren't working very hard, we were being extremely naughty.
In what way?
very childish on night shift. A whole lot of ridiculous things. We all turned up in tea cozies, all kinds of odd things. I mean, it was very childish.
Did you ever...
One rushed up to London and danced all night and caught the milk train back and then worked all day.
Pardon me, boy. Is that the Chattanooga Juju? Yes, yes. Track 29.
It sounds like a life out of a novel. But this bright young thing also had a moment with eerie echoes of today's debate about the way powerful men treat young women. It involved the newspaper magnate and Tory grandee Max Aitken, Beaverbrook. Lady Trumpington recalled the incident to the political writer Julia Langdon.
She must have been staying at his house, and she was putting her curlers in one night, sitting at her dressing table, when Beaverbrook came into the room wearing only his pyjama tops, not his pyjama bottoms. Anyway, she looked at him in the mirror and said, "Oh good, I'm so glad you've come, you can help me with these," and handed him the curlers to pass to her, and then he traipsed off.
The next whirl of parties involved cocktails in Manhattan. Jean worked on Madison Avenue in the post-war Mad Men days. And it was in the United States that she met her very English husband, Alan Barker, a historian then working at the Ivy League university Yale. His career brought him back to a teaching post at Eton, and then to the headmaster's job at the Lees, a private school in Cambridge. As a headmaster's wife, that Jean Barker, as she then was, really turned her attention to politics.
She became a councillor in Cambridge and then ultimately mayor of Cambridge, and I think she rather loved being mayor. And that was the beginning, really.
The couple had one son. Adam Barker grew up in Cambridge.
I always did joke to my mother that I had a mayor and not a mother, but anyway,
What do you mean by that?
Well, she had so many different interests. She was a magistrate, she was chairman of the Airline Users Committee, she was doing so many things.
Cambridge local politics was a long way from life in Mayfair and Manhattan, and her early political career was hard graft. She tried and failed to become an MP. Ian Hislop, her team captain, Have I Got News For You, is one of her admirers.
Her life feels a bit like a sort of gilded swanning about when you read the bracing, but actually, I mean, she became a local councillor, which shows a certain dedication. You know, it's not all glamour, and you know, it was very difficult for women to get into politics in those days, and she didn't seem to have as much support as some other women who went into politics, so she pretty much had to do it herself.
The political scene was dominated by another powerful woman, Margaret Thatcher, Adam Barker.
She loved Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she had a hard time because she spoke her mind, and Margaret didn't always like that.
I'm guessing that Mrs. Thatcher hadn't met many people who were quite as straightforward and blunt as herself, but in the Baroness's case, it was with added posh voice.
In 1980, Jean Barker was given a peerage by the new Tory government. She already had contacts in the House of Lords, including the Tory peer Viscount Astor, whose mother had been Jean's friend and fellow clerk at Bletchley.
Jean took to the House of Lords like a duck to water, and superb, because she has a wonderful turn of phrase, she's very intelligent, but also she has a wonderful sense of humour and a sense of the ridiculous. So she could actually kind of deflate someone who's being pompous, for example.
There remained the little matter of deciding on a title. Her reputation for a robust speaking style was already established, so she rejected Baroness Barker. She explained her final decision to the prominent 80s Tory John Gummer, now Lord Deben.
So she said I had to choose the village nearest to me, and there were two possibilities. One was Trumpington and the other was 6 Mile Bottom. She thought that was not a good idea, so Trumpington it was.
Her colleagues describe her as a mainstream loyal Tory. No one would call her a policy wonk, but in the House of Lords she found all the policy know-how she needed.
There's an expert there on almost everything. So if you have trouble about something, you've only got to go to Lord Poop Poop and say, please, could you help me? And Lord Poop Poop helps you. There are some near geniuses and some bloody awful idiots there. So you've got your choice.
And those idiots inspired the special Trumpington debating style, which would later bring her fame. Lord Astor.
Certainly, occasionally, if someone was making a speech that she disagreed with or she thought it was pompous, occasionally you'd hear the word bollocks come out from the back row. It's usually probably from Jean.
Lady Trumpington's husband Alan died after a stroke in 1988, leaving her a widow in her mid-60s. She was serving as a minister at Agriculture at the time, the first ever woman minister there, and threw herself into her work. Lord Deben was the Secretary of State.
Ministry of Agriculture is always tough and difficult because you're having to talk to very different audiences. And what Jean Trumpington could do would be to talk to a lot of audiences in a very convincing way. The food industry, the farmers themselves, the general public. People trusted her.
They were difficult days at the ministry. The mad cow disease crisis was at its height. Lady Trumpington maintained her sense of humour, even if it was, at times, a little ghoulish.
She went off to Madagascar, and she said, what do you want me to bring back? And I said, I don't mind at all. So she went off, she came back, and she came into my room, and she threw across the floor a long piece of very brightly coloured cloth. She said, it's a shroud. I thought you'd like it.
Unconventional political behaviour like that doesn't seem to have damaged her prospects. She survived at the ministry when John Major succeeded Margaret Thatcher, until...
At one point she was called into Downing Street, and John Major, it turned out, had decided that the time had come for her to retire from the front bench. And she was not expecting this. And she told me afterwards, shamelessly, that she cried, whereupon the Prime Minister patted her on the shoulder and said, there, all right then, well, never mind, we'll leave you as you are. So she stayed on.
By 1992, she was the oldest ever serving woman minister. And during John Major's second term, she became a baroness-in-waiting, representing the Queen on formal occasions, until the Tories lost power in 1997. She might have lived out her quiet retirement on the back benches, had she not been on the receiving end of an ungallant remark by the former Defence Secretary, King, in 2011.
And then the survivors of World War II started to look pretty old as well. So my noble friend, the Baroness, reminded me, I believe,
the V-sign she flicked from a sedentary position on the red benches was scarcely proper parliamentary procedure, but it made her famous.
I had friends from all over the world suddenly contacting me because of this viral thing from the House of Lords.
One thing led to another. Her appearance on Have I Got News For You was, in every sense of the word, a vintage performance.
I would like to know why, at the age of 90, I've had to sign a piece of paper in order to be on this show to say I wasn't pregnant.
I think she just imagined that here was a sort of satirical show and the audience would hate her and that the panellists would hate her, and she had no idea how excited I was. I mean, she'd been a land girl and had been at Bletchley, so I was thrilled, and our audience, she absolutely charmed. She's a Tory baroness. It's not exactly everyone's cup of tea. Essentially, she made absolutely no apology for who she was and what she thought, and that is very attractive. And on the whole, if people come over as themselves, then it works.
Ian Hislop. One of those watching that evening was the publisher Georgina Morley, and she spotted a book in the making.
I thought she was heaven on wheels, and I wrote to her and said, can I buy you lunch? And I got this one sort of really strict letter back on House of Lords paper saying, you may buy me lunch in the new year, Trumpington. And she walked into the restaurant, and the first thing she said to me was, is that wine? As I was sipping my mineral water, and I said, no, but we can get some. And she said, thank God for that, and we went on from that.
The result, coming up trumps, was, as you might expect, packed with anecdote. But Georgina Morley believes that Lady Trumpington's long life is rather more than an extended gag.
Women who were born in the 20s to lives of privilege in which they were basically expected to marry a nice man, live in a big house and give parties, who defy those expectations to have not one, not two, but at least 3 careers, and have only stopped having a career at 94. That's a feminist icon to me.
Lady Trumpington isn't giving up all her passions. Her enthusiasm for horse racing, for example, is as fierce as ever. But her son Adam says that by giving up the Lords, she's giving up more than a job.
The Lords became her family, and it still is, and there was a very emotional day on Tuesday when we went back for lunch, and this news of her retirement had just come out, and they were all coming up to her. And it's not just the peers, but the door attendants, the policemen, the people in the post office, and you could see the emotion there that this was her family and she was going to be leaving her family.
Profile was presented by Edward Sturton and the producer was Beth Sager-Fenton. The Sparsholt Affair is Alan Hollinghurst's new novel about a love affair set in Oxford during the Second World War. We'll find out what the Saturday Review panel made of it next.
I couldn't hurt her, Thomas. We had rows, of course we did. But if you'd seen us together, you'd know what I mean. We were meant to be forever. And then they killed her.
A condemned man protests his innocence.
But I swear to the God you used to believe in, I was nowhere near her.
But only his jailer will listen.
And now they're going to hang you for something you didn't do.
Ian Rankin, The Death Watch Journal.
But everyone says I did do it, Thomas. Everyone except you.
An original story for BBC Radio 4, this Monday to Friday night at 10:45.
Last year, approximately 4,000 tourists from the West travelled to North Korea. This year, there may be fewer, although tourists and business people are still entering the country. So why do people visit? We'll find out in Travels in North Korea. That's at 8 o'clock here on Radio 4. But first, it's time for Saturday Review with Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. Social life, it can be a nightmare, can't it? Not knowing what people's motives are and what they're really thinking about you. Secrets are unpacked, exposed and revealed in Sally Potter's film The Party this week, and in Alan Hollinghurst's new novel The Sparsholt Affair too. And Simon Stevens' play Heisenberg delves into the unknowables that remain when two human particles collide. With me to discuss all three are the critic Sarah Crompton, the writer Kevin Jackson and the biographer Graham Farmlow. Also on the programme this week, the relationship between risk and creativity, explored in a new radio series, The Gamble, and Degas' passion for perfection at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. First though, The Party, the seventh film from the British independent filmmaker Sally Potter, whose best known work is probably her adaptation of the Virginia Woolf novel Orlando. Where the plot of Orlando sprawled over continents and centuries, The Party is tightly confined to one place and one time. Celebratory drinks for Janet, a politician who has just received a big promotion. Sharing the moment with her are her husband Bill, April and her boyfriend Gottfried, and Ginny and Martha, a lesbian couple who have big news of their own.
So, everybody, it seems that we are expecting not one, not two, but 3 babies. Wow. People. Small people. Congratulations. Wow. Oh, wow.
Wow. Was that a boast or a cry for help, Martha? I couldn't quite tell from your tone of voice.
The miracle of conception.
Shut up, Godfrey. Listen, I'm going to propose a toast to my oldest, dearest, and most loyal friend who has achieved a rare thing, which is why we're all here this evening, in case anyone forgot. Babies, excuse me, Jenny, Martha, but babies get born every day in extremely large numbers to the point of endangering the planet and all our futures. It's not every day, however, that one of us becomes a minister in your entirely rotten and useless opposition party.
Patricia Clarkson as April, Cherry Jones as Martha, Bruno Gantz as Gottfried, and Kristen Scott Thomas as Janet, who finds that her own news is increasingly overshadowed as the evening wears on. Also present is Tom, played by Cillian Murphy, a city banker who arrives jittery and doesn't calm his mood by sneaking off to the bathroom to snort regular lines of cocaine. Sarah Crompton, The Party, describes itself as a comedy wrapped around a tragedy. Did the wrapping match the contents, did you think?
I felt it was very funny and brutal. I mean, absolutely savage. It's 71 minutes, and it's starkly black and white as the way it's shot. I mean, it's just absolutely like a farce from beginning to end, and underneath it, these huge themes of life and death bubbling up underneath. I was more convinced by the comedy than by the depth of the themes, but I did enjoy myself while I was watching it.
Kevin Jackson, it is being heavily sold as a comedy. The posters all have identified, quotations which say hilarious, marvellous, and so on. It's pretty black stuff, though, isn't it? The very first sight you see is an incredibly distressed Christian Scott Thomas raising a gun directly at the camera lens.
And as Chekhov says, if you show a gun in Act 1, it has to be deployed again in some manner or other somewhere in the film. I didn't play with them. I really, although I could see that a comedy was taking place before me, I found the film absolutely harrowing, but gripping. I thought it was excellent in a way I didn't expect. It certainly didn't strike me as a comedy. It struck me as much more in the mode of an old-fashioned, I mean that as a compliment, an old-fashioned, well-made West End play in which a group of people gather and each of them has a secret, and the secrets gradually become more complex and the interrelations of the secrets become more complex. It's much like, for example, an Inspector Calls without the supernatural element. I found it utterly gripping, but I didn't laugh once.
Graham Farmer, did you laugh?
I scarcely stopped laughing. I thought it was terrific. And I'm on Sarah's side here. I did find it very, very good, consistently witty. I would never have believed that this was Sally Potter's work. All credit to her. I mean, I thought this was a really unusual work for her. If I'd guessed, it seemed to me something that mid-period Woody Allen would make in homage to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Very, very intense, bringing together people in a narrow environment and just seeing what happens. Entirely successful. One of the things I liked most actually was its brevity. I mean, these days so many films are so long, and this I thought I'd go and see that again.
Yes, no, I mean it is very tightly done, isn't it? You mentioned Woody Allen. It's got that mockery of, as it were, the liberal intellectual prejudices of a certain class of people, doesn't it? As well?
I don't see how a film with the line "sisterhood is so passé, it's very aging," can possibly not be a comedy. I think it's full of absolutely zinging lines. And its trouble as a tragedy is that actually, in exposing sort of middle-class, right-thinking hypocrisy, slightly too much does happen within the space of 71 minutes to be entirely convincing.
There are some there are some fish in some barrels, aren't there? Gottfried, I mean, he is funny. Gottfried is this sort of hippie-ish character played by Bruno Ganz. It's his role basically to come on and utter vapid platitudes at the most distressing moments, which he does very well, but you've sort of seen that before, haven't you, that satire?
The curious thing is, though, that although he is almost impossibly annoying when you first meet him, he actually turns out to be one of the few of them who actually responds well when the crisis deepens, and you become slightly more sympathetic to him.
Well,
it helps that Bruno Ganz is such so lovable in this carnation, so very far from his version of the play.
The performances are amazing. I mean, I'm not sure that Bruno Gantz's life coach is a man I would want by my side when everything was going wrong, but his performance is staggering, and all of the performances are wonderful. I mean, Timothy Spall, who is this...
You haven't mentioned him so far. He plays Bill, and he looks from the very first frame as though he has just been hit by a truck. I mean, he looks in deep despair, doesn't he? And you're not quite sure. You find out later in the film what's happened.
And what she's done is gather this group of actors, and he being the best of them at it, who are amazing at showing thought. I mean, who actually, in their faces can show what they're thinking. I thought that was extraordinary.
The camera work aids and abets that, doesn't it? Because it's very, very pressed up against their faces at all times.
That, to me, is what made it a piece of cinema. It could, as Kevin said, I mean, it could almost have been a play, but the heightened reality of that black and white, done in real time, too. I thought that made it a particularly dramatic piece of cinema.
You haven't mentioned Kristen Scott. I picked a clip, for us to hear, and the producer quite rightly said, no, you've given far too much away about the plot if we run that. It has a moment of comic acting from Kristen Scott Thomas that I just thought was perfect. She's trying to calm herself down. She knows she's a politician. And she says, I have given talks on truth and reconciliation. And she ends it by screaming aloud and biting her own arm because she's so angry at what's happening.
I mean, it is hardly a state secret that she is, you know, a very, very, very fine actress or actor, but my gosh, she's off the scale in this one. I think she's superb.
I wanted to. I mean, we have compounded the sin. It seems to me. I see the adverts for this on the tube, and it seems to me in underlining hilarity, in underlining comedy, they've rather sold it short. It's an odd kind of film. It has an odd kind of atmosphere, and if you just go thinking it's going to be a comedy, I don't think it'll work on you in quite the same way.
That scene you're talking about, Kristen Scott Thomas, where it seems to me is the nub of it, where she keeps saying, I am not this person, I am not this person. And I think it's brutally, savagely brilliant at showing the way that people aren't quite who they think they are, and that faced with a crisis, whether it's the arrival of triplets or something else that happens, that you won't necessarily react in the way that you think you will. And I thought that was its kind of genius, really. I think that's its cleverness as a film.
Okay, well, The Party, Certificate 15, is on wide release now. A comedy like The Party would be impossible if people had a Newtonian transparency in their actions, all the forces perfectly calculable and predictable. But of course, we don't. We are mysterious in our motions. That fact is, notionally, at the heart of Simon Stevens' play, Heisenberg, The Uncertainty Principle, which begins with a glancing, apparently accidental interaction. A young woman, Georgie, kisses a much older man, Alex, on the neck. This is something of a surprise to Alex. The two have never met before, but Georgie explains it as an embarrassing case of mistaken identity, and they get talking. And Georgie really does like to talk.
If you watch something closely enough, you realize you have no possible way of telling where it's going or how fast it's getting there. Did you know that? If you pay attention to where it's going or how fast it's moving, you stop watching it properly. That's the truth. That's actually scientifically been proven as the truth by a scientist, Werner Heisenberg, 1927. The uncertainty principle. I watched my son all the time. He took me completely by surprise. Every man I meet looks exactly like him. They have the same hair, the same eyes, they move the same way of breathing. You don't, though, remind me of him. You're exceptional in that sense.
Anne-Marie Duff as Georgie, who seems genuinely drawn to Alex, much to his bemusement. But what are her real motives, and should he care either way? This production is directed by Marianne Elliott with a minimal design by Bunny Christie as the opening play from her new production company, Elliott Harper. The play opened in America last year, where the New York Times reviewer described it as the sexiest thing on Broadway. And if you were to guess that Mr. Ben Brantley is a man past the first flush of youth, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. Kevin Jackson, there is an element of male fantasy to the setup here, isn't there?
Well, I was sort of astonished to discover that the playwright is still in the full flush of at least of midlife, because this struck me as being the kind of theme that is usually addressed, for example, by Woody Allen in Manhattan, as an entirely older, creepy older male's fantasy project. And usually when it's treated, and I suppose the archetype here is probably the Blue Angel, it's often treated with sort of farcical cruelty and pathos, as far as the old chap is concerned. This is. Well, it's being marketed as a feel-good production, and I think it's not much of a spoiler to say happiness, optimism prevails at the end. But it's astonishing to see this theme treated in such a blithe manner.
I had
Sarah
trouble
Crompton.
with this. I think Simon Stevens is a very elegant writer, and so, you know, it's impossible not to enjoy the words as they come out. But the idea that a 40-year-old woman will go up to a 75-year-old man on a station and kiss him on the back of the neck is just not uncertain,
Can I
but
just-
improbable.
We should say, of course, that there is a plausible reason given as to why she might do this, which has nothing to do with his attractiveness. I mean, that is one of the play's revelations. We don't want to give too much away about it. So there is a rationale there.
There is a rationale, and once you climb over it, the relationship that develops between them is quite tender and quite interesting. But you do have to climb over that moment. And for a theatre company that wants to represent women's voices, which is part of what Marianne Elliott has said she wants to do, and to give women a voice, I find that it's quite an odd play to start with.
Graham Farmley, your deep knowledge of physics is not really going to be greatly tested here, is it?
I don't even mind physics.
Schrodinger's play is both good and bad until it's actually observed. What happened?
Working on that one.
What happened here when you saw it?
Well, I had trouble getting past the title. I mean, the author and indeed both characters put Heisenberg front and centre with his uncertainty principle, which is about quantum physics, about the subatomic world, makes a very specific statement about about the limitations of knowledge you can have. You can dramatise that. Michael Frayn has shown us in Copenhagen brilliantly. But here, I really did, with the best will in the world, struggle to see what the relevance of that epistemological
It's sort of been taken as a very rough metaphor, hasn't it, for the unknowability of people and the unknowability of our futures, that we can't know how our lives are going to plot into the future.
William the Conqueror would have known that. I mean, you didn't need Heisenberg in 1927 to say that. I have to say this: I rarely had such an evening of sumptuous theatre in service of such a weak play. I mean, Marianne Elliott is a wonderful director. I personally regret that she chose this as her first play. Two superb actors, Kenneth Cranham and Anne-Marie Duff. Great lighting, great design, but it seemed to be in service of something that really was quite thin.
That Bunny Christie design is very beautiful, isn't it? It's completely minimal. There's nothing on stage. There's a backwash of light, and then the sides and edges of the stage pulse in and out and close in on the characters at various times. Marianne decided, I think unwisely, to have little music and movement interludes between some of the scenes. I thought that was unnecessary, actually, and it slowed this thing down, which should have had the speed. You could have done it in 71 minutes, just like the party, I think, if you'd made it a bit brisker.
Well, it was terribly pretty, but I didn't feel that the prettiness sort of added very much to the play, and I had a feeling about the whole thing that there was a sort of strange discrepancy between the relatively small and intimate nature of the drama and the gigantism and the brilliance really of its staging. I completely agree with everything that my colleagues have said. I would simply like to add that I think that Kenneth Cranham, I rave about him the way that I rave about Kristen Scott Thomas. I think without the sort of the humanity and the humour that he brought to the part, it would have seemed a very improbable character indeed.
I mean, I had problems with her character. She is the manic pixie, not quite dream girl, dream milf, whatever. And I just
careful, Tom.
The moment she comes on and starts doing that act, I just think to him, run. Yes. I know she's very good looking and she's young, but run. She is obviously crazy.
And it is to Anne-Marie Duff's credit. I mean, I agree about Cranham. He brings his wonderful sort of benign quality to the part and a kind of grace. I quite like the dancing sequences, and I liked him, how he moved and the kind of gracefulness of it. But I think it is to Anne-Marie Duff's enormous credit that she just about makes you believe in that character, and certainly makes you believe in her motivation for seeking a relationship with this man. And I do think that the truthfulness of their playing was exceptional. And what's odd about the play is he's got a better metaphor in it, which is about music. The most touching scene in it is about music and how you have to listen to music and the space between sounds. And that's much
predictability again comes into it, doesn't it?
But better than Heisenberg, who's just sort of a modish icing somehow. It's very odd.
Did any of you feel at times, I mean, I did do the mental experiment of thinking, well, how would this play work if we reversed the genders here? And it did seem to me it would have been maybe a less believable play, but a slightly more interesting one. All of your responses would have been altered by that, wouldn't they? Your notions of what is predatory, what is not predatory would have been changed around completely.
Yes, and it would have certainly fulfilled that kind of idea that, you know, you're giving women a voice. I mean, the trouble with this character's voice is it is the voice that you so often hear on a stage, you know, kind of vulnerable, mad, sort of slightly desperate. I mean, it's not a very interesting voice, whereas, yes, you're absolutely right. If it was an older woman and a younger man, that would have been fascinating.
Okay, well, Heisenberg, The Uncertainty Principle by Simon Stevens continues at the Wyndham Theatre in London until the 6th of January next year. You're listening to Saturday Review, and my guests this week are Kevin Jackson, Graham Farmelow and Sarah Crompton. If you ever miss the live broadcast of Saturday Review, you can catch up anytime you like, along with lots of other BBC Arts programmes, including Front Row. They're all available as a free download, and you can find out a little bit extra about what our reviewers have been doing on the podcast of our programme. You can find links on the Saturday Review website, or you can email us on saturdayreview@bbc.co.uk. I got ticked off this week for putting a spoiler in on Blade Runner, but I hadn't. I was guiltless. Anyway, Alan Hollinghurst's new novel, The Sparsholt Affair, opens with a vignette of physical attraction. A group of undergraduates in an Oxford room during wartime, looking across the quad at a new arrival, exercising with weights in front of his window. Looking on are Everett Dax, the son of a celebrated novelist, Freddie Green, a would-be writer and the narrator of the memoir we're reading, and Peter Coyle, a painter. The man in the window is David Sparsholt, and both Everett and Peter become slightly obsessed with him. Peter invites him to pose for a picture, while Everett lingers in one of the college's communal bathrooms in the hope of striking up a conversation. And then, one day, as he tells Freddie, what he's hoped for happens.
He'd spoken to her, and it seemed they'd had a brief conversation. He said it had gone very well, in fact, and sat rather solemnly picturing it all before getting up again to glance out across the quad. I don't know, I said. I hope Sparsholt won't grow suspicious about these bathroom encounters. You mean you feel it's all right for you to encounter him, but not for anyone else? I saw this was actually my view about various matters. You're not interested in him anyway, said Everett, and then quite suspicious for a second. Or are you? I said, I've developed an interest in him purely as the focus of your interest. Yours and Peter's, I added, and watched him scowl. I'm following the whole Sparsholt affair scientifically. I'd hardly call it an affair, Everett said. And then, why, what's Coyle been up to? Poor Everett looked haggard at the thought of his rival spending whole hours alone with Sparsholt, with the license to stare at him and move him around, to ponder at leisure the nakedness he had glimpsed for a mere second, and all the while, in the semi-abstracted way of the artist, to draw him out about his past, his thoughts, and his feelings.
This memoir of Oxford days only forms the first part of the book, which later follows the life of Sparsholt's son, Johnny, an artist who grows up in the shadow of a more serious Sparsholt affair, and who meets up with his father's old friends in London before going on to have a child of his own. As in The Swimming Pool Library and The Line of Beauty, Alan Hollinghurst's protagonist is gay, this time experiencing the transition from a time when homosexuality is still clandestine and illegal to a period when people post their sex lives on their Tumblr feeds. Graham Farmelow, it is a historical novel of a kind. Does he get the feel of his periods right, do you think?
Well, to me, I thought it was beautifully crafted, and one of the characteristics of that craft, it seems to be, was he paints his characters very vividly, but the periods are really quite pastel. They're not portrayed in any great detail, or sometimes they're indicated by TV programs, for example, which have quite a strong presence in the book. I have to say, for all Hollinghurst's craft, and he's an undoubtedly accomplished novelist, I found that I was concentrating more on that craft than I was on the characters. I found them not particularly engaging. Only towards the end of the book did I feel the cumulative power of his technique paying off.
Okay. Sarah Crompton.
I think it is the same thing, really, as Graham. I think sentence for sentence, it's absolutely beautiful. It's a wonderful sort of read. You can't put it down. I couldn't put it down. But I'm quite a sort of simplistic reader at some levels, and I became so interested in the characters that I was frustrated by the fact that at the centre of this book is David Sparsholt, who is described as a glamorous blank, and who Hollingsworth deliberately keeps as a blank. He doesn't really explain him. And all the way through, I longed for a bit more of him.
One absolutely should not judge a book by its cover, but the cover of the book is empty picture frames, and one of the characters here, begins his artistic career working on frames. There is that sense, isn't it, that that's what we're looking at, that the picture in the middle, David Sparsholt, is not there, and all around him are these people looking at him, obsessed with him, thinking about him. Kevin Jackson.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I enjoyed the novel a good deal, despite the fact that it doesn't have a very strong narrative drive to it. And I think I was rather...
We're getting all versions here, aren't we? Because Graham didn't feel that. You did feel that.
Yes.
You couldn't put it down.
But I felt the first chapter I thought was absolutely entrancing. It reminded me very, very strongly of Philip Larkin's novel of Oxford during the wartime, Jill. And indeed, there's a character called Jill, and one can't help but think, tip of the hat there. I was rather disappointed when we read forward to the 1960s, partly because I'd agree with Graham that I found the main character agreeable but forgettable. But the technique is extraordinary. It's a novel with a lot of, how does one put this, hinterland to it. Lives which characters come on and then they might disappear and they might only come back when they're dead. But in the meantime, you get the sensation that there are all these other quite complex lives being lived in the silences of the novel.
Well, that character Jill, in fact, she's quite present in the very opening chapter.
In a heteronormative novel, she'd be the love interest.
Well, and she disappears completely and then comes back very vividly indeed with an odd revelation of character right towards the end of the book that is very startling, and yet her life in the interim is summed up in a couple of paragraphs, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's fascinatingly rich. I mean, it is significant that Johnny, who effectively is the main character, the son, is and who you see from adolescence to old age, he's a painter. And so what he does, and he's a portrait painter, so what he's doing is looking at people, watching people's motivations. And every time a character does appear, that there is that sense of them looking, and you get everything like the textures of beach towels and the way that chairs feel, and it's so rich, but it is deliberately constructed around an emptiness, and that makes it quite an interesting, challenging read.
It is all quite good about art, isn't it? And there's a section towards the end where you describe Johnny, you're with Johnny when he's undertaken a commission to do a family portrait that he doesn't entirely like the family, and the sort of the hesitations and the reversals as he goes through the process of thinking, well, actually, I really don't like them, so I'm going to paint them quite harshly, but actually, they won't buy it, if I don't say. And that was terribly convincing, and one imagines that Hollinghurst either, has painted himself on those painters quite well.
It's also good about anxiety. Almost every character in this book is anxious at some point. They're anxious. I mean, they are anxious with the normal anxieties of life that we all have. But I think he's very good at detecting that. There's a moment when Johnny, when he's a young boy, asks to detour because he wants to go and have a look at a church. And his father agrees. And then he's suddenly overcome with anxiety that the church be up to this diversion. He takes on the responsibility of this detour going right, and then he feels he has to like the church more than he actually does. And I thought that was so accurate.
I thought that was a brilliant touch. And later in the novel, again, there are some sequences where you see, as it were, from the point of view of a young girl, and I thought those were very convincing as well.
That's sort of what Maisie knew kind of section of the book.
Yeah, much the last section. That was a homage to that.
Did any of you get? He has a trope, I think. very often of beginning a sentence. It has a sentence which sort of says, it was a bit A, but it was also not a bit, not a bit A. He both states something and then negates it. And it comes across as a kind of accuracy. But I found that sometimes there was a little bit too much of that.
I really noticed that. It's always a regret and a relief, or a relief and a regret. He does it all the time. And it does have that sense, I suppose, of creating. One of the things he's very good at is creating this sense of life. I mean, of life going on outside the pages. And, I think that's part of what that does. And he's such a stylist. I mean, he's always compared to James and to Eliot. The thing I think about them, and that he isn't yet, though I think of all, he could be, is she does explain slightly more even without explaining. And
you said
George Eliot, so that she or Henry James would eventually kind of give you a little bit more. And that's what I long for. I think he does withhold all the time, Hollingsworth, and I kind of wish he didn't.
Okay, well, The Sparsholt Affair by Alan Hollinghurst is published by Picador. As a figurative painter, I'm guessing that Johnny Sparsholt would have been an admirer of Degas, himself an admirer of his great artistic predecessors. As a new exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge makes clear, Degas had little time for the idea of the artist's genius as a matter of inspiration and internal temperament. It was all about work and obsessive dedication. That is my idea of genius, he said of Ingres, a man who finds a hand so lovely, so wonderful, so difficult to render that he will shut himself in all his life, content to do nothing but indicate fingernails. The Fitzwilliam show explores Degas' own submission to previous artistic masters, and some of his own obsessions too, with ballet dancers, with women seen as if unaware that they're being watched. It also concludes with a brief display of artists' responses to Degas since, including works by Howard Hodgkin, Francis Bacon and David Hockney. Sarah Crompton, the Fitzwilliam, has its own pretty good holdings of Degas works, but they've borrowed a few more for this show. What did you think of the show?
I thought it had all the strengths and weaknesses of a show that's built mainly around your own collection. And some of the additions felt like padding. But fortunately, the Fitzwilliams' own holdings are utterly wonderful. It's got some wonderful things, including some of the very rare wax sculptures, which are the first sculptures that Degas made, that aren't like the bronzes. They've got the urgency of a man sort of pressing his fingers and making shapes.
They're little lay figures,
little tiny figures of girls doing arabesque or dancing with a tambourine. And they summarise what's, to me, so wonderful about him. And you get from the show that there's movement everywhere. Even in his prints, where that you can see people leaning or moving their hips. I did love it.
Kevin Jackson.
This is the week of the Harvey Weinstein revelations, and I think that some people's response to the show might be flavoured by that, and I just wanted to go on record very vehemently as saying that none of Degas' friends ever knew him to have an affair, even of a most overt kind, the most banal kind with a woman. He never is known, and this is an environment saturated with gossip, he is never known to have had sexual relations with any man, woman or child ever.
But yet
a remarkable number of people take it for granted. Some of my friends on Facebook, for example, take it for granted that he was a predator and a terrible abuser of his models.
It comes about, doesn't it, because of the particular way of looking at those models. I mean, and it's a sort of it is a critical reaction to him. I mean, it's interesting. They have foregrounded it, the Fitzwilliam here, haven't they? They've actually put it out. They've made it clear that he thought carefully about not having models looking as though they were available to a gaze. And then a little later, you get a line where he says, "I prefer to look as though I've been looking through a keyhole." So it is that voyeuristic idea. Graham Farmerlow, what did you think?
Well, I'd like to say I think it's a real achievement for the Fitzwilliam here, because I think they, as Sarah said, they have remarkable collections here. The way they've taken up Maynard Keynes's picking up of those of the pictures when shortly after Degas died, and also working in partnership with the Denver Art Museum. I thought they did a very fine job of highlighting the whole story of Degas in a way that was very persuasive. And a big shout out to Jane Munro, who I thought did a superb job of curating the exhibition and with the sumptuous catalogue. One thing she does there, which was very striking, that she highlights Degas' unpredictability, and I think for some people that would be quite surprising, because
given that he does the same
exactly, people that's the view you hear expressed occasionally, but I think there was a very good sense here of that he was not nearly as predictable as he's often made out to be. You see his landscape pictures that are completely, and I've never seen him do a war picture before, the one 1865, which I've never seen before. I didn't know he dabbled in poetry either. So there was a lot here that I personally learned from this show.
Sarah Campton, coming back to that idea of the artist's gaze and the male gaze and so on, I wonder what you felt about that. There are early pictures. There's a picture of 3 women at a race event, seen from the back. Just a lovely picture, and it does seem to be a picture about women talking together. I mean, they make that point themselves, which doesn't seem at all intrusive, predatory at all, and then yet you go on to...
I've never got this about Degas. I do totally agree with Kevin that it seems to be that it's the intimacy of the gaze that's shocking. And actually the intimacy is there when he's got fully dressed women talking to racecourse, which is wonderful. Or there's an amazing unfinished picture in the cafe, which is 2 women talking, and you just feel that you know they're talking about the end of the affair. You know they're having a real heart-to-heart about things. And even the pictures that are overtly of prostitutes are very kind. They're not harsh.
They're not all kind, are they?
Well,
he has a painting which is mirrored, in fact, because he does a reverse treatment of it, of a woman just out of the bath, and her body has clearly been, put into the most peculiar contortions for his sake. I mean, what you get from it is you think all he's thinking about is how do you draw a leg if it's in that position, but it's still slightly odd.
And that's the other point that the show and Jane Munro make very well, which is that he was drawing on that tradition of classicism and of the nude, and he just takes it a bit further, and he is interested in how a leg falls or how something happens. And yes, some of them are shocking, but most of them have got this kind of wonderful kind of quality of thinking they're interesting people. He paints the red slipper as well as the nude body. I think there's something wonderful.
Okay, well, Degas, A Passion for Perfection, is at the Fitzwilliam Museum until the 14th of January, and admission is free, we should say that. One of the paintings at the end of that Degas exhibition is the Lucian Freud nude, a picture I looked at in a slightly different light this week, having just heard the first episode of The Gamble, a Radio 4 series about the connection between risk and creativity. Lucian Freud's own addiction to gambling was the subject of the first episode of the series, in which 2 of his former friends and models, David Dawson and the art historian Martin Gayford, recalled how it seemed to be driven not by a desire to win, but to lose.
His gambling did take on quite a creative flair, and he would gamble away till he had nothing left, and that somehow freed him up to then start painting again.
For Lucian, it was a sort of purging process. He told me that he remembered an occasion on which he'd spent the afternoon betting on a series of horse races and lost all disposable cash he had at that time, went back home, got his car, which presumably was a Bentley as usual, took that to a garage, sold it, got the proceeds, went back to the bookmakers, put that on a horse race as well, lost that, and afterwards went home in a peaceful state of mind in which he felt, now at last I can get back to painting. Since he had the confidence and energy to feel that he could somehow get back all this money by painting a picture, he might have felt energized by losing everything.
Martin Gayford and David Dawson. In the second episode, performers, including musician Laura Mvula and the actress Juliet Stevenson, talk about the gamble of appearing before an audience, even when you fear that you may not be able to perform. Kevin Jackson, what do you think of the Lucy and Freud program?
Matter and impertinency mixed. The archive and the eyewitness accounts were gripping and full of wonderful anecdotes, and I hadn't realised, I knew that he was fond of a bit of flutter. I didn't realise that it reached the stage as a
That doesn't quite cover it, does it?
No. It's clear that he was in the grip of the most appalling sort of addiction. I thought the way... So though there's a hard core of about 20 minutes of really compelling stuff, I thought the way it was dressed up was annoying. There was a lengthy poem.
You don't buy the thesis then?
Well, the thesis that the meta, I can understand the idea of painting as a risky business as a metaphor, but if you push it more than a bit further, I was very glad to hear a piece of archive from Francis Bacon who said, well, of course it's not, it's not actually risky. It's not like being bomb disposal man or something like that. Very remarkably few painters have had their limbs blown off.
No, they have to just start again. Sarah Crompton.
I thought that the slight problem that you get with it, I thought the Freud one was riveting. I've also listened to the second one in the series, and actually it becomes more what Kevin's saying about the first one. So the first one concentrates on Freud and does reveal stuff about him that I didn't know at all, and links it quite convincingly to his art. When in the second one you get more voices talking about risk and about the idea that acting or playing the piano or singing is a risk, it becomes thinner and it becomes really purely sort of anecdotal, but unrevealingly anecdotal, I felt.
Graham Farmer, you're nodding about the difference between the first and the second.
Yeah, very strongly. Yeah, I thought the first one was terrific. I mean, we most of us knew that Lucia Freud was a gambler, but as Kevin said, this is gambling of a shocking nature. But I did think it was something that was really sassy and well done. I must say, I thought the narration by Noma Dubasvili was excellent.
Yeah, she narrates all the programs. It's very attractive and compelling voice.
Well done. And when I heard that one, I thought this is going to be a terrific series, right? I thought this is going to go on to all sorts of walks of life here. And then we go into the second one, which struck me, frankly, as a bit of a dog for breakfast.
It's much more routine, the second one, because you've heard those things before about the terror of appearing live. I still think there were some interesting elements in that, but the first one, I'm slightly allergic to exactly that notion to turning the artist into a hero figure and a gladiator, and so I was a bit resistant to this idea of risk. But I thought they made a case with Lucien Freud that there was something going on about control, and he was anxious about control in his painting, and he wanted to get to a place beyond that. And so his relationship to Bacon is important, because Bacon is a much wilder painter, and clearly Freud envied that but didn't know quite how to get there.
No, I absolutely agree that as a case study of Freudian case study, it was entirely convincing. It's when it leaps over into the notion of the painter as existential hero, which is frankly something of a clown notion, isn't it? That I lost patience, and also I didn't like the way it was dressed up with lots of groovy period music. Hey,
oh, I liked it.
Oh, I hated it.
It's all right.
And then they had an awful poem, worthy of E. Jarvis Thribb.
I'm not sure that the poem added a huge amount to it. But you were talking about Degas as the painter's painter. Freud is the bohemian's bohemian, isn't he? I mean, he gets into trouble. The craze he has to run is... there's a wonderful anecdote where his American dealer takes him up, and casually in conversation he says, well, I've just got this little gambling debt, it's a bit awkward. And the dealer magnificently says, well, look, I'll settle that for you. And when he actually goes to find out what the figure is, it's £2.3 million.
No, I'm just going to say, I mean, what a contrast here. This person, as you say, who's so reckless, contrast with Degas, who for him, he didn't believe in spontaneity. He was somebody who really wanted that control to be front and
center. Well, except the level of work that Lucien, a couple of sitters are very good about the way he works. He sort of dances in front of the canvas, and again, he's obsessive.
Yes.
Works like a Trojan when he's finally purged himself. But didn't you think it was interesting that when he becomes successful, when his paintings really start to spell,
he stops
gambling sort of almost overnight? It just isn't any more necessary to him.
Because he can never get rid of money, and
that doesn't. Well, you can always get rid of money. Somebody will always give you a bet big enough to get rid. That made no sense at all.
And it is odd because he's got this thing which he says to Martin Gafer, which he says, Martin Gafer says it must be fun to win, and he says it's quite fun to lose as well. And that's a really insightful thing about somebody who's so much in the grip of gambling.
I think Dostoevsky got there first, but I mean, it's it is a persistent truth. Okay, well, the gamble begins on Wednesday at 9 p.m. on Radio 4. And that's it for this week. My thanks to my guests, Graham Farmelow, Sarah Crompton, and Kevin Jackson. Next week, Armando Iannucci's film, The Death of Stalin, Russian Art at Tate Modern, and La Belle Sauvage, part 1 of Philip Pullman's new trilogy, The Book of Dust. Next week's guests, I can tell you, are giddy with excitement.
Saturday Review was presented by Tom Sutcliffe, and the reader was Gary Duncan. And speaking of The Book of Dust...
Are you Malcolm Polstead? Yes, sir. My name is Asriel. I'm the father of the baby in the priory.
Return to the world of his dark materials.
It's a demon.
For the new adventure from Philip Pullman.
What's the Rusakov field? Malcolm managed to say. Why is it important? Dust.
The Book of Dust. Volume 1, La Belle Sauvage. Read by Simon Russell Beale.
The woman's name hit Malcolm like a bullet. This was Lyra's mother.
Next Saturday afternoon from 2:30 on BBC Radio 4.
Despite its reputation as a closed country, there's been an increasing interest in travel to North Korea. So what's it like to go there? Travels in North Korea is after the news.
BBC News at 8 o'clock. The organisers of the Oscars are meeting to decide whether the film executive Harvey Weinstein should be expelled. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences called the emergency meeting after a string of high-profile sexual assault allegations, which Mr. Weinstein denies. Whitehall officials believe Iran was responsible for a sustained cyber attack on Parliament in June. Hackers tried to guess the passwords of 9,000 email accounts and compromised up to 30. A Canadian man who was kidnapped with his pregnant wife by Islamist militants in Afghanistan 5 years ago has said that during their captivity she was raped and one of their children was killed. The family has flown back to Canada after being rescued by the Pakistani military. Kurds in northern Iraq are involved in a standoff with troops backing the Iraqi government after both sides clash near Kirkuk. The two groups have for the past few years been battling Islamic State fighters. A family who became stranded in the Scottish Highlands has been rescued by the steam train used in the Harry Potter films. Their canoe was swept away in a remote area. From Glasgow, Megan Patterson reports.
The Jacobite locomotive is used for tourist excursions on the West Highland Line. The steam engine and the route, which includes the impressive Glenfinnan Viaduct, were made famous to new audiences in the Harry Potter films. Recognisable as the Hogwarts Express, the train provided an exciting rescue for John and Helen Cluett and their 4 young children. They'd become stranded at a remote bothy shelter near Lochaber as their canoe was swept away by a swollen river. After a call to Police Scotland, the train made an unscheduled stop, taking the family to the nearest station.
Football, Manchester City are top of the Premier League, thrashing Stoke 7-2. Crystal Palace have their first league win of the season, beating the defending champions Chelsea 2-1, while a stoppage time goal sealed a 2-1 win for Watford over Arsenal. BBC News.
Lena resumes her affair with Nino in Reading Europe, Italy, the story of a lost child at 9 o'clock here on Radio 4. But first, Archive on 4 opens a new window on a country which has dominated the headlines over the past year, North Korea. The radio producer Sarah Jane Hall mixes location recordings and interviews recorded over the past 15 years to get an insight into this most secretive and closed-off nation in Travels in North Korea.
The proposed summit meeting between North and South Korea has been postponed, and the talks between the North Koreans and Washington about nuclear weapons have been suspended.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens.
It's been
been a day of disturbing rumours. Outside North Korea, that is. People inside this country have been told absolutely nothing by their intensely secretive comms.
Has asked North Korea to provide an immediate explanation for a mysterious explosion reported to have taken place 3 days ago in the
States like these constitute an axis of evil.
When I visited North Korea back in 2004 to record a radio documentary, to try and find out what it was like to be in a country so little understood, it was hard to imagine that the political temperature could get much higher.
Trump claimed our leadership wouldn't be around much longer, and hence, at last, he declared a war on our country.
I couldn't have been more wrong.
No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles.
The situation seems to be sliding out of control, and it's made me wonder, is it easier to go to war with a country we don't understand? And what did I learn from going to the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? What do all visitors learn from going there? What's it actually like to be there?
I really think it's the most unusual country I've ever been to, and I think it's the most unusual country that I'm ever going to visit.
Andrew Matheson, a Korea diplomat who visited Pyongyang 12 years ago.
It's really so different.
Only 5,000 people from the West visit every year, for business, for study, or out of curiosity, a number which has dropped off rather rapidly in recent weeks, although not quite to zero.
Yeah, my dad's just been, all his family were trying to persuade him not to go because we were it was just before the Rocky Man speech, but all the tensions were building.
So what do you see when you go there? Who do you meet? And what about the morality of travelling to a country that's so tightly controlled, with stories of famines, gulags, nuclear arms? Many people think you shouldn't be going there at all.
I think it's really difficult. I think anybody who does go to North Korea does face quite a bit of shock. I mean, it really is a totalitarian state.
Who does the money made by tourism go to? Grace Joe, North Korean defector.
The propaganda purposes and fundraising purposes as well. They need money from foreigners.
Using some of the programs made for Radio 4 over the past 15 years, including my own, I've brought together some of the archive to give a glimpse inside this secretive and oppressive society, including some familiar voices.
When you get to the place where North Korean and American and South Korean troops do literally stand eyeball to eyeball, just simply raise them about 2 inches off the ground, a line of concrete, and that's it. And if they want to walk, put the toes on either side of it and literally go eyeball to eyeball, they can.
Let's begin our journey in Beijing in 2004.
The international gateway to North Korea is China, and it's also the base for a travel company specialising in getting tourists into the world's most inaccessible country.
Tony Pletz, presenter of the series I produced called The Great Leader, The Dear Leader and The Tour Leader, followed a group of travellers into the DPRK.
Yeah, but what...
Nick runs his tours from a hotel bedroom in downtown Beijing, where I was booked with a group of 12 other hopeful travellers on an overnight train journey. It seemed already there was a small crisis brewing.
So they've taken our seats. That's not very fair for our tourists, so I mean, can they not go by plane?
The tour leader was Nicholas Bonner, who first visited as a young architect student in 1993.
It's like going to Bognor Regis. On a mystery holiday, you get on the train, you don't know where you're going to end up, except Bognor Regis on a wet day had more tourists visiting it per day than Pyongyang at that time had per year. So we all arrived, and you get out and you go, where's the fun? And like Bognor Regis, it takes a little bit of time to find it. And then that was the other big shock, was to go down the border, because then things start sort of fitting into place, because without this background, without really, all I knew that was the Korean thing split after the Second World War and then after the Korean War. And when you hit the border and it's sort of a million men facing a million men on the other side, that's moving. It's a very sad place.
My name is Andrew, and I visited North Korea in 2004. I was living in Beijing at the time, working as a diplomat. It seemed like a really good opportunity to go to a country that was different and not visited by many people.
I
understand that this delegation is important, but if they are so important, maybe they should fly.
And the tour manager was very experienced in the country, and he had very good relations with the North Korean tourism authorities, who were our minders, you would say.
Yeah, as you say in Korea, over mountains, there are mountains. Okay, go with that. Come on. Bye-bye. Great.
I told you we should have done holidays to South of France. Fishing delegation, whoever they are.
The chain has been, I think, gesammt is the word.
So we're looking at various other ways of getting in. At the moment, there's a cargo flight
on boxes of chickens.
Thursday. Yeah, that would be interesting. So we will see. But at the moment, it's not looking too good for the train. Our lovely Korean lady who's looking after us is in tears at the other end, concerned about helping. Nothing is easy when the transport system isn't as good as it could be. There's limited international trains and flights, and you have come right in the thick of it.
And he knew the boundaries of what we could see and what we couldn't see.
It's impossible to overstate just how seriously they take anything to do with Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il. We won't get sent to the gulag for saying the wrong thing or anything like that. But the guides that the group will have, they're responsible for your actions.
Don't run off from your guides. Watch what you do with your feet. No pornography, weapons, drugs, or American flags.
North Koreans don't read the same papers as you do, probably, unless you read the Rodong Sinmun Party Daily exclusively. Don't try and free anybody's mind or anything like that, because A, it won't work, and B, they won't do it to you. They're not going to brainwash you. So please return the favour. Oh, one other thing. If you make an international phone call, you should consider that to be not entirely secure. All right. So we just meet at the station? Yeah, the idea is, I think Nick plans to get to the station.
I'd quite like to see something a bit different. Absolutely. And I can't help but think North Korea will be something a bit different. But do you think people think it's dangerous to go to North Korea?
Absolutely. I mean, I haven't told my mother I'm coming to North Korea. As far as she was concerned, I was going to Beijing, and she thought that was scary enough. So I've not let on that I was actually going to go on to North Korea after that, because she'd be worrying sick for a fortnight about whether I was having my fingernails pulled out or whatever,
Reading all the human rights reports and everything, the camps, the fact that until recently pregnant people weren't allowed into the capital, old people weren't allowed into the capital.
Do you have quite a bleak view of what you might be going to see?
I'm anticipating the worst. Then I think everything will be shown on this tour is what they want us to see, so we won't see any of the bad things.
This all sounds a bit British Rail to me. We've got to get off and have a special bus service. Can you explain what's going on here?
There's no leaves on the line. Chinese trains run beautifully. I mean, we are sat here in a six-berth, very luxurious sleeper with a Chinese gentleman and a Chinese lady. Hopefully there'll be two Koreans to meet us on the Chinese side. They will then take us to a bus and we'll drive down and go through, across the border and probably drive all the way to Pyongyang, which will be a first. Oh, no. Oh.
Where's the tickets? As the train rumbled into the night, we retired to our bunks. To read the guidebooks we would have to throw away. It's probably our train that's full of all the cadres and prospects.
We first went into the country from China at Dandong, crossed the river and went into a town called Sinuju.
To say thank you, it's 감사합니다. 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 조선 하나다. Korea is one. Hey, 자 베이징에 오다대마. Well, we're off. Boys and girls, on your as we drive over. On your right-hand side is the bridge that was bombed in the Korean War by American and maybe British imperialists. If you want to take a photograph, then I suggest sort of fine until halfway when the bridge ends and then cameras away.
Now, we had permission to travel down to Pyongyang. It was the first time the tour company had ever attempted that, but they did have permission.
Liu. This is it. We either get it now or we don't get it. But we're in no man's land, I would say. fairgrounds that do work. I've seen these fairgrounds working. So you drive around in old MiGs.
Next stop, DPRK Customs, where a team of immaculately uniformed officers went through our bags.
My first few hours of North Korea were, I remember for being more bizarre than any other country I'd been to.
Peter Kirby, who was just 21 at the time.
So I had just arrived in Shanghai in September of 2004, studying at a Chinese university. A relative of mine had a friend who was a proper China head. He was a journalist who worked for the South China Morning Post. And he said, if you really want to understand China, you should go to North Korea.
As we drove into Synergy, the North Korean border town, Lee Jung filled us in with some facts and figures as we peered out into the alien-looking streets.
The ideological revolution means to help each other, love each other, and to have
just coming down the road, it's like we're coming into a small town. Some revolutionary slogans.
From what I remember, we were sort of bumped off the train and landed in this border town. While they, I presume, were doing all the paperwork for us to continue our journey by road, we stayed in this hotel. And naturally, we wanted to get out of the hotel, and I remember kind of walking to the gates and the fence of the hotel and looking at the people walking past. What shocked me most, I think, was when we tried to wave at them or have any contact, they just kept their eyes ahead of them and pretended we weren't there.
It must be such a bizarre spectacle, these foreigners suddenly standing at the gates for no particular reason.
Definitely, especially as we're all peering over the bars.
There was almost complete silence because there was no traffic. The only traffic was the odd, very old truck, really decrepit trolley buses trundle past. People walked everywhere. And there were weird, soft footfalls as people walked because they didn't have leather shoes, they had some kind of cloth shoes, and they just sort of padded past.
I think if this had happened anywhere else, I'd be wandering around and going to the market. I mean, there's a big statue up there which is just in sight but not quite close enough, and propaganda posters and things which I'd really like to go and look at.
We were allowed out in the grounds, but we had to stay behind the fence. It felt like we were animals in a cage in a zoo, and we were looking out. And once we saw this old army truck taking workers home. They were sitting on the back of this truck, the flags were flying, and they were singing these songs with great gusto. It was like something out of a play or a movie.
Most of the people wandering around are dressed in very dark, somber suits. Everyone's sort of cycling or walking at a really kind of easy pace.
But you know, it's cool when you have nothing to do. All this stuff on the road gets pretty exciting. That we just saw some street cleaners come by, and there was a lady with a cart of cabbage. That was cool.
I saw a rabbit cross the main road.
We clearly didn't get run over, that's for sure. We're not going to have any roadkill here.
Are you quietly confident that we're going to get
Oh, yeah, we'll get somewhere, but we'll see. Just wait. There'll be no problem waiting.
We were led into a dark, cold foyer, ushered into a smoky bar, and were confronted by a bunch of local lads playing pool.
I do remember that. That was, I think, one of those moments probably where we saw North Korea as relaxed as it probably usually is. That was pretty good fun, you know, trying to put a game together, you know, them smoking away. It was just like going into a bar in China, you know.
Who's like actually playing? I mean,
it's a lunch break. It's a bunch of lads who giggle actually. And, that's it. It's stopped.
It's finished. It's all over.
Well, that's it. I think who they are workers, and they're going back to their lunch break. Lunch is over.
So the State Department recommends that you do not go to North Korea. I mean, they can't stop you, but they strongly advise you to not go there.
In 2016, Hannah Yi, a Korean-American journalist, was invited to visit a friend who had been studying in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital.
I did have friends send me a lot of articles about Otto Warmbier, who had recently been arrested. It was kind of coincided around the same time.
University of Virginia was sentenced by North Korea's Supreme Court. The student said he had removed a political banner from a staff.
All of us flew into Beijing, we met in Beijing, and then the next day we woke up very early and took a Koryo airline. So this is, I believe, North Korea's only airline. What was interesting was once you got inside the plane, they had little screens that you could watch, you know, their Boranbang band is what they're called, and it's this all-female band where the women are chosen, the performers are chosen by, you know, the supreme leader, and it's them performing nonstop on this flight to Pyongyang. All the songs are very ideologically heavy, so it's all about, you know, the supreme leader and how great he is. It's about this ideology that they have called Chuche, which is about self-reliance and we're a great country, we have nothing to envy. So it's a lot of patriotism that you're sort of, you know, shown right off the bat as soon as you get on this plane.
And what about when you arrived in Pyongyang?
So when we got to the airport, they kind of went through all our luggage. Prior to us leaving for North Korea, we had gotten very strict guidelines as to what we could pack, what we could bring. No Bibles, no religious sort of trinkets or, you know, prayer beads, nothing like that. No magazines, no Cosmo, no GQ, no Vanity Fair, nothing like that. Just basically we were told, like, bring your clothes, bring your shampoo. We were all told to delete any photos on our cameras or even on our phones. The photos that we had taken, don't even bring a laptop with anything on it. And so once we got in to the airport, they screened everything. A couple of my friends took over for having photos that they took on the plane or whatnot, and there was a discussion, should we delete it or not, and it was fine and we got through. But once we got through security, it's a very clean airport. I think the thing people sort of don't think about North Korea being is that it's actually very clean and organized, and everything is brightly lit in this airport. There was a little stand for coffee. There was a stand to buy things, and once we got there, we kind of waited around until our minders came. And we had 2 minders and a bus driver kind of stay with us the whole time. And once we gathered our stuff, we got on the bus and headed to our hotel, Pyongyang's premier hotel. And it's sort of on this isolated island, and it's very tall, and it's touted as like their best, amazing, world-class hotel. There's a restaurant at top that has one of those spinning vistas that you can sit in and dine and see all of Pyongyang. But when we got there, it was pretty dark. It was late at night, and we checked in and went to our hotel rooms and waited for the next bus.
When we got to Pyongyang, we stayed in a hotel that most foreign visitors to the capital are familiar with. It's on an island in the river.
Andrew Matheson, career diplomat in 2004.
And because there's such shortage of electricity, there's hardly any electricity in the hotel. Only one lift out of the bunch of lifts would work. Most of the light bulbs have been taken out. Everything was dark. The lights in our hotel room were so weak that we wore head torches just to move around the room, let alone to read anything. Desperately short of energy.
The other thing about that hotel was we were under strict instructions that you couldn't leave the hotel or leave that supervision. Having a conversation about, oh, should we just, you know, cross over and, you know, go to a cafe or something, and the answer is always no.
They played quite a high floor in the hotel that looked out over the city, and it was almost completely dark. There were hardly any street lights. There was very